The land office door swung open so hard that it cracked against the interior wall, and every head in the room turned to see Dorothy Lockhart standing in the frame, her black mourning dress powdered with trail dust, her dark eyes blazing with something that was equal parts grief and absolute fury. "I am filing this claim today," she said, her voice cutting through the stale air of the Laramie County Land Office like a blade through canvas. "And if any man in this room tries to stop me, he will regret it." Timothy Bancroft had been leaning against the far wall, arms crossed, hat pulled low, waiting for the registrar to sign off on a routine matter for his employer, Harlan Griggs. He straightened the moment she walked in, not because he was startled, but because something about the woman in the doorway made every nerve in his body stand at attention. He had seen plenty of determined women in his 29 years moving across the Wyoming territory. He had never seen one who looked quite like she was carrying the weight of a condemned man's sentence and still managing to walk upright. The registrar, a wiry little man named Phelps, looked up from behind his cluttered desk with the expression of someone who had just discovered a rattlesnake beneath his chair. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I have already explained to your late husband's attorney that the Lockhart parcel is currently under a secondary dispute filed by the Griggs Cattle Company. There are procedures that must—" "My husband has been dead for 6 weeks," Dorothy said, stepping fully inside and letting the door fall shut behind her. She moved to the desk and placed a leather satchel on the surface with a deliberate, controlled thud. "These are the original land patents issued to James Lockhart in 1876. These are the deed records from the territorial office in Cheyenne. And this is the sworn statement of 3 witnesses who watched my husband break that ground and build that house with his own hands." She pulled each document out one at a time, laying them flat with precise, unhurried movements. "The claim belongs to me now. I am his legal heir, and the Griggs Cattle Company has no legitimate filing that predates any of this. What they have is a forgery, and I believe you know it." The air in the room turned to glass. Timothy felt something cold move through his chest. He worked for Harlan Griggs, had worked for him for 3 years. He knew that Griggs had sent a man to the land office 2 weeks prior. He had assumed it was routine business. He had not asked questions, because cowboys who asked too many questions about their employer's legal dealings did not stay employed for long in the Wyoming territory in 1879. But standing in that dusty room watching Dorothy Lockhart lay out her evidence with shaking but unstoppable hands, Timothy felt the cold thing in his chest start to take shape into something he recognized as shame. Phelps looked at the documents. He looked at Dorothy. He looked across the room at Timothy, as though Timothy might provide some kind of rescue. Timothy pushed off the wall and straightened fully, and he did not rescue anyone. "I would like to speak to the registrar privately," Dorothy said, and her voice had dropped to something quiet and dangerous. "I would also like the witness who is standing against that wall to understand that I know who he works for." Her eyes found Timothy's across the room, and the collision of that gaze was something he would spend the next several months trying to describe to himself and failing. It was not merely anger she was directing at him. It was a kind of terrible recognition, as though she had already decided exactly what kind of man he was and was daring him to prove her wrong. He surprised both of them. "I will step outside," Timothy said. He picked up his hat from the peg by the door, and he walked out. He stood on the boardwalk in the bright Wyoming morning and breathed the cold October air and tried to understand what had just happened to him. 6 weeks earlier, in the last days of September 1879, the word had moved through Laramie like water finding the lowest ground. James Lockhart was dead. The homesteader who had settled the disputed stretch of bottomland along the Platte River's eastern fork 3 years prior had been found by his hired hand at the base of the eastern ridge, his horse standing riderless 30 yards away. The official verdict was a riding accident, a broken neck. The kind of thing that happened to men who pushed horses too hard over rough country. Timothy had heard the talk. He had also heard the other talk, the kind that moved through saloons and bunkhouses in the dark hours, the kind that nobody put their name to. Harlan Griggs had wanted that bottomland for 4 years. The Lockhart parcel sat exactly between Griggs's northern range and the river access that fed his summer grazing grounds, and Griggs was not a man who accepted inconvenience patiently. James Lockhart had turned down 3 purchase offers, each one larger than the last, and after the third rejection, Griggs had stopped making offers and started making different kinds of plans. Timothy had told himself it was none of his business. He was a hired hand. He managed cattle drives, handled logistics, kept the peace among the ranch hands. He was not Harlan Griggs's conscience, and he was not a lawman. He rode, he worked, he collected his wages, and he kept his head down. That was the code he had lived by since coming west from Ohio at the age of 22, running from a life that had included a dead father, a failed farm, and a broken engagement that had left him convinced he was not the sort of man things worked out for. But then Dorothy Lockhart had walked through a door, and something in the code he had written for himself cracked straight down the middle. He did not know much about her at that moment, standing on that boardwalk. He knew she was a widow of 6 weeks. He knew she had come alone to the land office, which meant either she had no one to come with her, or she was the kind of woman who did not feel she needed anyone. He knew her hands had been shaking when she laid those documents on the desk, but her voice had not. He had been watching both. He stood there for 23 minutes by the clock on the land office wall, visible through the window. When the door opened and Dorothy came out, her satchel now tucked under her arm and her expression holding something fragile underneath the iron, she stopped short to find him still on the boardwalk. She had expected him to be gone. He could see that clearly. "You are still here," she said. "I am still here," he agreed. She studied him the way a person studies a door they are not sure they should open. She was perhaps 27, he thought, with dark hair pinned beneath a black bonnet and a face that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances, and was still, despite everything, remarkable. Grief in her eyes was deep and recent and real, and it made him feel the shame in his chest sharpen into something that demanded action. "My name is Timothy Bancroft," he said. "I work for Harlan Griggs." "I know who you are," Dorothy said. "I have seen you at the Griggs Ranch when I came to deliver my husband's grazing proposals. You were always the one in the background, watching." He had not known she remembered him. The information did something complicated to him. "The registrar," he said. "Did he accept the filing?" She looked at him for a long moment, deciding something. "He accepted it provisionally. There will be a hearing in 30 days to resolve the competing claims. The territorial judge will come from Cheyenne." She paused. "Mr. Phelps made it very clear that the Griggs filing has supporters in this town who will make that hearing difficult for me." "He is right that they will try," Timothy said. "Is that a warning?" "It is a fact," he said. "What you do with facts is your business." She tilted her head slightly and something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but a cautious recalibration. "Why are you telling me this?" He thought about that honestly. "Because what I saw in that office was right and what Griggs has filed is wrong. I have known it for a while. I just have not done anything about it until right now." "Telling me that a hearing will be difficult is not exactly heroic action," she said, "but there was no cruelty in it." "No," he agreed, "but it is a start." She looked at him another long moment. Then she said, "I am staying at the Prairie Hotel on 2nd Street. My wagon is broken down on the North Road, and I need to arrange for someone to bring my things into town. If you know of a reliable teamster, I would appreciate the recommendation." It was not an invitation. It was not warmth. It was a test, he thought, of whether he was actually useful or merely full of words. "Old Pete Callahan runs a freight service out of the livery on Elm," he said. "He is honest and he does not talk about his client's business. Tell him Timothy sent you." She nodded once. Then she walked down the boardwalk and turned north, her head straight and her shoulders back and her morning dress trailing in the dust of a town that was already conspiring against her. Timothy stood there watching her go, and the thing that happened to him in that moment was not something he had words for. It was the kind of feeling that arrives without asking permission and takes up residence in the center of a man's chest, and refuses to leave regardless of how loudly he tells it to go. He went directly from the land office to the Griggs Ranch, which sat 6 miles northeast of Laramie, a sprawling compound of barns, bunkhouses, and a main house that Harlan Griggs had built to look like. He had always had money, even though Timothy knew from a former Griggs hand that the man had started with nothing and had accumulated everything he owned through methods that rarely bore close inspection. Griggs was on the front porch when Timothy arrived, a large man going thick through the middle, with a heavy gray mustache and eyes the color of old iron. He was holding a telegraph slip in one hand and a glass of bourbon in the other, which told Timothy that someone had already sent word from the land office. "The widow filed," Griggs said, not looking up from the telegraph slip. "She did," Timothy said. "Phelps give her anything, provisional acceptance, 30-day hearing before the territorial judge." Griggs made a sound in his throat that was not quite a curse and not quite a laugh. 30 days. Well, he finally looked up at Timothy. "You were in the office when she came in." "I was. And," Timothy chose his words with care, "she had documentation, original patents, deed records, witness statements. She came prepared." Griggs's eyes narrowed slightly. "Harlan Griggs has been in this territory for 11 years. This widow has been here 3. Who do you think the judge is going to favor?" Timothy said nothing. "I need you to ride out to the Lockhart parcel," Griggs said. "Make sure my boys aren't letting the fence situation deteriorate. And if the widow shows up out there, you make sure she understands that her time on that land is limited." Timothy heard the instruction. He heard what was underneath it too, the hidden motive that wore the face of legal dispute but had teeth of a different kind. He said, "I understand," because he needed Griggs to believe he was still a reliable instrument. He did not say what else he understood, which was that he was not going to deliver that message to Dorothy Lockhart in the spirit in which it was intended. He rode out to the Lockhart parcel the next morning, and what he found there changed the shape of everything. The land was genuinely beautiful. He had ridden past it before but had never paid it the attention it deserved. The eastern fork of the Platte cut through the western edge of the property, clear and cold, and running with the kind of current that spoke of deep snowmelt from the Laramie Range. The bottomland was rich and dark, thick with the kind of grass that fattened cattle without effort. James Lockhart had not been a fool. He had found something worth fighting for. There was a house on the rise above the creek, modest and square, built from timber that someone had taken genuine care with. A kitchen garden had been put in behind it, now going brown with autumn but clearly tended well during the growing season. There was a small barn, a chicken coop, a root cellar set into the hillside. Someone had built a life here, deliberately and with love, and that life had been interrupted 6 weeks ago when James Lockhart had died at the bottom of a ridge. Griggs had 2 men camped at the fence line on the eastern boundary, which was technically on Griggs's side of the property. They were not technically trespassing. They were also not there by accident. They were there to be seen, to be a presence, to remind whoever came and went from this land that it was being watched and that its future was uncertain. Timothy spoke to them briefly, told them he was checking in on Griggs's behalf, and then rode north along the fence line, making a show of inspecting the posts and wire. While he did, he was actually cataloging something else entirely. He was looking at the land and thinking about the hearing, and thinking about what evidence might exist that Griggs's filing was forged, and thinking about the woman in the black dress whose hands had been shaking but whose voice had not. He was not yet sure what he intended to do. He was a man who had spent 7 years carefully not getting involved in things that were not his direct concern, and the habit of non-involvement did not dissolve quickly. But it was dissolving. He could feel it going, like ice in April, slow and then suddenly all at once. He rode back to town and found the Prairie Hotel and stood outside it on the boardwalk for fully 5 minutes before deciding that this was ridiculous and going in. Dorothy Lockhart was in the small parlor off the lobby, sitting at a writing desk with papers spread before her and a cup of tea going cold at her elbow. She looked up when he came in, and the surprise that crossed her face was quickly controlled and replaced with that careful watchfulness she had directed at him the day before. "Mr. Bancroft," she said. "Mrs. Lockhart," he said. He held his hat in his hands. "I have just come from your property." Something moved behind her eyes. "Griggs sent you. He sent me to inspect the fence line and to deliver a message I did not deliver." She set down her pen. "What was the message?" "That your time on that land is limited." He wanted it delivered with implication. He paused. "I did not deliver it that way because I do not work for Harlan Griggs in the way I apparently used to." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her deciding whether to trust this. He could not blame her for being slow about it. He was a man who had worked for Griggs for 3 years, who had ridden past that parcel and said nothing, who had known the rumors about James Lockhart's death and asked no questions. "You are telling me you have had a crisis of conscience," she said, and there was just enough dry precision in her tone that it might have been humor under different circumstances. "That is one way to put it," he said. "What is another way?" He thought about that honestly. "I am telling you that I have been the kind of man who looks away from wrong things because getting involved is inconvenient, and I am standing here in your hotel parlor because I have apparently reached the end of my capacity for that." She looked at him for a long time. He noticed that her eyes were not actually dark, as he had first thought. They were a very deep brown with something amber in them, like creek water over dark stones. The observation was not useful, and he filed it away. "There are 2 of Griggs's men at my fence line," she said finally. "I know, I saw them. They are meant to intimidate me." "Yes. Are there others, other things Griggs has planned that you know about?" He considered what to tell her, and decided that partial truths were a form of betrayal, and she had had enough betrayal already. "I know that Griggs has a relationship with 2 members of the county commission who will attend the hearing. I know that his attorney is a man named Caldwell who is ruthless and willing to misrepresent documents if he believes he can get away with it. I know that Griggs believes the judge can be managed because there are old debts between them." He paused. "What I do not know is whether any of that is true, or whether it is just what Griggs wants his people to believe so they act with confidence on his behalf." Dorothy absorbed this with a stillness that he found extraordinary. Another woman might have wept or raged. She sat at her writing desk and absorbed information the way a general absorbs intelligence reports, sorting it, weighing it, deciding what it changed. "Will you testify at the hearing?" she asked. The question landed on him like a stone dropping into still water. The ripples of it spread outward in every direction at once. To testify for Dorothy Lockhart was to end his employment with Griggs, certainly. It was to make an enemy of one of the most powerful men in Laramie County. It was to step from one side of a line to the other in full public view. It was to risk the stable if limited life he had built for himself in this territory. "I would need to know what I am testifying to," he said carefully. "The truth," she said. "Whatever you know about the Griggs filing, about its origins, about whether the document is legitimate." "I do not have direct knowledge that the filing is forged," he said. "What I have is circumstantial understanding. The timing. The way Griggs spoke about the land before and after your husband's death. The manner in which he sent someone to the land office with very specific, very quiet instructions." He paused again. "But I know someone who might have direct knowledge." Her head came up. "A man named Ira Cole. He was Griggs's bookkeeper until 8 months ago, when Griggs let him go under circumstances that Cole did not take well. He knows where the financial records are kept. If the Griggs filing involved money changing hands with a county official, Cole would know about it. Where is this man now? Last I heard he was in Carbon County, town called Rawlins. He drinks too much and he talks too much and he hates Harlan Griggs with the kind of passion that only comes from feeling genuinely wronged." Dorothy looked at her papers. She looked at her cold tea. Then she looked at him with an expression that had something new in it, something that was not quite warmth but was the thing that comes just before warmth, like the light that appears on the horizon before the sun. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. It was the same question she had asked on the boardwalk, but she asked it differently now, with less armor in it. He had been asking himself the same thing since he walked out of that land office and kept walking until he was at her hotel door. The honest answer was tangled and complicated and involved things he was not entirely sure of himself, but he gave her the truest piece of it he could find. "Because your husband built something real on that land," he said, "and because you walked into that office alone and shaking and you did not let any of it show in your voice, and because I have been the kind of man who looks away for a long time, and I am tired of what that man sees when he looks in a mirror." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture to it. "I need to get to Rawlins," Dorothy said finally. "Rawlins is 120 miles, he said. "Stage runs twice a week from Laramie. You would need to leave Thursday if you want to be back before the filing deadline adjustments." "Then I will leave Thursday," she said. There was another silence, and in it something was negotiated wordlessly. "I would not recommend traveling alone," he said. "Not on that road. Griggs has men who know the stage routes." She looked at him with an expression that was absolutely clear in its meaning. She was not going to ask him. She was not going to make herself dependent on a man she did not yet trust, regardless of the risks. So he said what he should say and said it plainly. "I would like to accompany you to Rawlins, if you will allow it. As a protection and as a resource. You do not have to trust me. You only have to decide whether the potential benefit is worth the risk of my company." Dorothy Lockhart looked at Timothy Bancroft in the small parlor of the Prairie Hotel in Laramie, Wyoming, on a Tuesday in October of 1879, and after a careful and thorough assessment that he could feel her conducting as plainly as if she had said the words aloud, she said, "I leave at 7 in the morning on Thursday." The stage to Rawlins ran through the high country south of the Laramie Range, crossing Medicine Bow Pass at an elevation that turned the air sharp and cold even in mid-October. There were 9 passengers in the coach when it left Laramie, but 6 of them disembarked at a way station at midday, leaving Dorothy and Timothy and a third man who slept with his hat over his face for most of the journey. In the rocking, rattling intimacy of the stage coach, Timothy learned things about Dorothy Lockhart that no amount of deliberate conversation could have produced. She learned things about him in the same way. It was the particular kind of knowing that comes from proximity under difficult conditions, where small reveals accumulate until a portrait emerges. He learned that she had come west from Pennsylvania in 1876 with James Lockhart, whom she had married at 24 after knowing him for 2 years. He learned that James had been a good man who worked hard and loved the land with a genuine and uncomplicated devotion. He learned that the marriage had been a partnership of mutual respect and shared purpose, and that Dorothy had grieved it honestly and was still grieving, but that grief had not made her passive. She had told him some of this directly, and some of it he had read from the way she spoke about the land, the way she referred to James by his first name with a cadence that was neither romantic nor businesslike, but something in between. The voice of a woman who had been with someone long enough to love them in the practical, daily way that is often quieter than passion, but runs much deeper. She learned, in the way that proximity over rough terrain produces honesty, that Timothy had come west from Ohio in 1872, after his father's death had left him with a failed farm and no clear future. She learned that he had spent 2 years working cattle drives up from Texas before settling in Wyoming, that he had worked for 3 different outfits before ending up with Griggs, and that he had known for at least a year that Griggs was not the kind of employer a man with a conscience should stay with indefinitely. She did not ask why he had stayed. He thought she probably understood. The West was full of men who had traded their principles for steady wages and warm bunkhouses, and the comfortable fiction that what their employers did was not their direct concern. They stopped for the night at a way station halfway to Rawlins, a rough establishment run by a married couple named Hensley, who provided decent food and minimal sleeping accommodation. Dorothy got a small room with a door that locked. Timothy slept in the barn with the horses, which was not unusual and not uncomfortable, and which he preferred to the alternative, which was sharing the common room with several men whose relationship with soap appeared to be theoretical. Over the supper table, which they shared with the Hensleys and two other travelers, Dorothy asked him about his life before Ohio, and he told her about his mother, who had been a schoolteacher and had died of fever when he was 15, and about his father, who had loved farming and been bad at it with a consistency that was almost artistic. He told these things with the dry, careful humor of a man who has had time to make peace with hard memories, and Dorothy listened with the particular quality of attention he was beginning to recognize as distinctly hers, fully present, missing nothing, responding to what was actually said rather than what was expected. She laughed once, genuinely, at a story about a cow that his father had purchased for a premium price on the grounds that it was extraordinarily productive, which turned out to mean productive of stubbornness rather than milk. The laugh was brief and surprised, as if it had escaped before she could decide whether she was ready for it, and it changed her whole face, and Timothy felt something in him go dangerously warm. He did not say anything about it. He looked at his plate and took a drink of coffee, and reminded himself that she was 6 weeks a widow, and he was functionally a deserter from her enemy's employ, and this was a business arrangement made under duress, none of which entirely worked. They reached Rawlins on Friday afternoon and found Ira Cole in the third saloon they checked, which Timothy had expected because it was the worst of the three, and men who had been drinking too much for 8 months generally graduated toward the worst options available. Cole was a small, sharp-faced man in his 40s, with the particular complexion of someone who had been drinking steadily for long enough that it had become his primary relationship with the world. He looked at Timothy with immediate recognition and suspicion, and he looked at Dorothy with the complicated expression of a man who has not been in the presence of a respectable woman in some time and is not sure how to calibrate himself. "You work for Griggs," Cole said to Timothy, which was a reasonable opening position. "I did," Timothy said. "I resigned as of yesterday." Cole's eyes moved to Dorothy. "Who is she?" "Dorothy Lockhart," she said before Timothy could introduce her. "My husband was James Lockhart. He owned the bottomland parcel on the eastern fork of the Platte." Cole's expression changed. Something moved through it that was complicated and not simple, and Timothy thought it might be the specific expression of a man who has been carrying information that weighs on him and has not yet decided whether he is brave enough to use it. "I heard about Lockhart," Cole said carefully. "What did you hear?" Dorothy asked. Cole looked at his glass. He looked at the bar. He looked at Dorothy, and then he seemed to make the decision, the kind that cannot be unmade, the kind that requires something to be done with it after. "I heard it was an accident," he said, "and I know it was not." The saloon around them went on being a saloon, full of noise and smoke and the general commerce of men avoiding their troubles, and in the middle of it Dorothy Lockhart sat very still and absorbed what Ira Cole had just said and did not look away from him. "Tell me," she said. Cole told her. He told her about the payments he had recorded in Griggs's financial ledgers, 2 payments to a man named Decker who had no other legitimate connection to Griggs's operation, payments that corresponded in timing to the period just before James Lockhart's death. He told her about the land office filing, which he had helped to prepare on Griggs's instruction, pulling deed records from the county archive, and altering the recording dates on copies that were then submitted as originals. He told her about Caldwell, the attorney, who had advised on the technical mechanics of the forgery and had been paid in a combination of cash and future land consideration. He told her about the county commissioner who had agreed to appear at the hearing as a character witness for Griggs's claim, whose agreement had been purchased with the cancellation of a private debt. He told her all of this, and his voice became steadier as he went, the way a man becomes steadier when he has finally put down a weight he has been carrying too long. Timothy sat through it and felt the pieces of something enormous clicking into place, each revelation connecting to information he had held but not assembled, and the assembled picture was as dark as he had feared. "Will you testify to this?" Dorothy asked Cole when he had finished. Cole looked at his hands. "Griggs will come after me if I do. He will come after me regardless," Dorothy said. "He is already coming after me. The question is whether the truth is louder than the threat." Cole was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I kept copies of the relevant ledger pages. I took them when I left. I was not sure what I was going to do with them, but I took them." "Where are they?" Timothy asked. Cole reached inside his jacket and produced a folded envelope that had clearly been carried there for some time. He placed it on the table between them. "I kept them because I knew this day would come," he said. "I just did not know what day it would be." Dorothy picked up the envelope. She held it with both hands and looked at it, and the expression on her face in that moment was one Timothy knew he would remember for the rest of his life. It was not triumph. It was something more complicated than triumph, the specific expression of a person who has been told the worst thing they could imagine and found in the same moment that they might actually be able to survive it. They stayed in Rawlins that night, and Cole agreed to accompany them back to Laramie to provide a sworn deposition before the hearing. He was nervous and he drank too much that evening, but he showed up at the stage the next morning, pale and determined in the way of men who have made an irrevocable decision and are committed to living with it. The journey back to Laramie was different from the journey out. The coach was more crowded. The pass was dusted with early snow. Dorothy sat across from Timothy and Cole, and at some point in the long afternoon stretch, the rocking of the coach sent her into a brief, exhausted sleep, her head tipping sideways against the wall of the coach, and Timothy found himself watching her with an attention that he had stopped pretending to himself was purely practical. She was extraordinary. That was the simple and inconvenient truth of it. She was extraordinary in the way that very few people were, not because she was perfect, but because she was genuinely, fully herself in every moment, without performance, without the kind of social calculation that most people employed instinctively. She was afraid and she showed it only in her hands. She was grieving and she let it be present without letting it stop her. She was, he thought, the bravest person he had met in Wyoming, and he had met a considerable number of people who had reason to claim that adjective. He was in love with her. He had the honesty to name it to himself in the privacy of his own head, even while knowing that the timing was terrible and the circumstances were impossible, and she had every reason to see him primarily as an instrument of justice rather than as a man. He was in love with her, and it was the kind of love that had not announced itself with fanfare but had arrived over 48 hours of crisis and cold food and terrible roads and honest conversation, settling into him with the quiet authority of something that had been waiting for the right person to attach to. He was not going to do anything about it. Not yet, and possibly not at all. She was a widow of 6 weeks. He was a man who had been, until 4 days ago, employed by the man who might have murdered her husband. The only appropriate action was to help her win the hearing and then, if she wanted nothing more to do with him, accept that with whatever grace he could manage. The hearing was set for the 14th of November, giving them 12 days from their return to Laramie to prepare. In those 12 days, Timothy did more things that were irreversible. He went to the sheriff of Laramie County, a man named Patterson who had a complicated reputation, but who Timothy believed, on the basis of 3 years of careful observation, was fundamentally honest when presented with facts he could not dismiss. He laid out what Cole had told them along with the ledger pages, and he named Decker, the man whose payments appeared in Griggs's records in the weeks before James Lockhart's death. Patterson listened. He asked questions. He was, as Timothy had expected, deeply reluctant to move against Harlan Griggs without substantially more than a former bookkeeper's testimony and photocopied ledger pages. But he agreed to bring Decker in for questioning, which was something. Decker turned out to be in Carbon County and was not immediately findable, which was concerning but not dispositive. The search for him became one of the background threads of those 12 days, something that Patterson's deputy pursued while everything else was being assembled. Timothy also went to Griggs. He went because he needed to understand what Griggs knew and what Griggs intended, and because there was a part of him, stubbornly persistent despite everything, that wondered if there was a version of this where Griggs was confronted with the full weight of what was being prepared and made the choice to step back from the fight. He did not believe this was likely, but he had the conversation anyway because the alternative was to never know. Griggs received him in the study of the main house, behind a large desk, with the particular stillness of a man who has already received reports about things he did not want to hear. "I understand you have been to Rawlins," Griggs said. "I have," Timothy said, "and you found coal." "I did." Griggs looked at him with the old iron eyes, and Timothy felt, for the last time, the weight of 3 years of employment, the wages, the bunkhouse, the stability that had been a reasonable substitute for a life. "I gave you steady work," Griggs said. "I treated you fairly." "You did," Timothy agreed, "and I am grateful for it. But what you did to James Lockhart and what you are doing to his widow is wrong, and I cannot continue to work for a man who does those things." "You cannot prove a thing about Lockhart," Griggs said, and his voice had gone very quiet and very flat. "Coal can," Timothy said, "and coal is in Laramie. And the ledger pages exist." Something moved through Griggs's face that was the nearest thing to fear Timothy had ever seen there, and it was gone very quickly, replaced by the old iron composure. "You are making a serious mistake, boy." "I know," Timothy said. "I have made a lot of them. This is not one of them." He left the Griggs ranch for the last time and rode back to Laramie, and he went to the Prairie Hotel parlor and told Dorothy what had happened, and she listened to every word with the quality of attention that had become one of his favorite things about her, and at the end of it she said, "Thank you," in a voice that had something in it that neither of them acknowledged directly but that Timothy carried for a long time. In those 12 days, they worked in close proximity on the preparation for the hearing. They met every day in the hotel parlor, sometimes in the morning and sometimes in the evening, and always for longer than was strictly necessary for the practical work of assembling documentation and preparing testimony. They talked about the evidence and then they talked about other things, and the other things gradually took up more of the time. She told him about Pennsylvania, about the small city of Reading where she had grown up, the daughter of a hardware merchant. She told him about coming west with James, about the terror and the beauty of the journey, about setting eyes on Wyoming for the first time and feeling, against all reasonable expectation, that she was looking at home. She told him about building the house on the rise above the creek, which James had insisted on building with his own hands, because he wanted it to be something he had made, and about the first winter, which had been so brutal that they had genuinely feared for their lives, and had survived it largely through stubbornness and the charity of a neighboring homestead family named Pryor. She told him these things in the even-toned, precise way she told everything, but the emotion in them was never far below the surface, and sometimes it surfaced, briefly and without warning, and in those moments Timothy had to exercise considerable restraint. He told her about himself in return, with more honesty than he had been comfortable with in a long time. He told her about the engagement that had ended badly in Ohio, a woman named Clara who had been sensible enough to realize before the wedding that Timothy was the kind of man who was going to spend his life traveling towards something he could not name yet, and that she did not want to spend her life waiting for him to figure out what it was. He told this story with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had had time to understand that Clara had been right, and that her decision had been a kindness to both of them, even if it had not felt like one at the time. Dorothy listened to the Clara story with particular attention. When he finished, she said, "Have you figured it out, what you were traveling toward?" The question went straight through every defense he had built around the relevant information, and he looked at the papers on the table between them and said carefully, "I think I am beginning to." The silence that followed was extraordinarily charged, and Dorothy broke it by reaching for a document and making a note, and he let her, because the time was not yet. The 14th of November arrived with a cold, gray sky, and the kind of wind that comes off the Laramie Range in November like it has a personal grievance. The hearing was held in the county courthouse, a room that was not particularly large and was made smaller by the number of people who had come to watch. Laramie was a town that loved a dispute, and a dispute that involved a widow, a powerful cattle baron, a forged land document, and a cowboy who had turned against his employer was the kind of story that generated audience. Harlan Griggs sat at one table with his attorney Caldwell, a tall man with the precise, cold appearance of someone who had been professionally deceptive for long enough that it had settled into his features permanently. Dorothy sat at the opposing table with the attorney Timothy had found for her, a younger man named Albert Marsh who had practiced in Cheyenne and had come recommended by the Territorial Land Office as someone with specific expertise in fraudulent claims cases. Timothy sat in the gallery. He was not the first witness, but he was a witness, and he sat through the opening statements with his hands folded on his knees and his eyes on Dorothy's back, watching the straightness of her spine and thinking about courage. The judge was not the man Griggs had expected. The judge Griggs had anticipated, whose presence he had apparently been managing through old relationships, had been taken ill in Cheyenne, and the territorial chief justice had sent in his place a recently appointed judge named Horace Fenwick, who was originally from Massachusetts and had no existing relationship with Griggs and no investment in the outcome of the case beyond the correct application of the law. Caldwell's opening statement was smooth and authoritative, and contained several statements that were misleading without being technically false, which was his particular specialty. He argued that the Griggs filing predated any legitimate Lockhart claim, that the documentation was properly registered, that the widow's filing was an attempt to exploit sympathy to override legal process, and that the Lockhart land had been improperly homesteaded on grounds that Caldwell promised to demonstrate through expert testimony. Albert Marsh's opening statement was shorter and more direct. He said that the Griggs filing was forged, that he would demonstrate this through documentary evidence and witness testimony, and that the questions raised by the death of James Lockhart were directly relevant to the current proceeding. At the mention of James Lockhart's death, the room went very quiet. Judge Fenwick looked at Marsh over his glasses with an expression of professional interest. "Counselor, you are aware that this is a land dispute proceeding, not a criminal investigation." "I am aware, Your Honor," Marsh said. "The relevance will become clear." Fenwick nodded. "Then we will hear it." Ira Cole testified first for Dorothy's side. He was nervous in the way of a man who has spent months telling himself he would do the right thing if the moment ever came, and is now finding that the actual moment is harder than the imagined one. But he testified completely and honestly, laying out the financial records, the forgery process, the names and the dates and the amounts. Caldwell cross-examined him with surgical aggression, attacking his drinking, his termination from Griggs's employ, his motivation for testifying, constructing the picture of a bitter and unreliable former employee with a vendetta. Cole held up reasonably well. He was not unimpeachable, but the ledger pages were, and they sat on the clerk's table in front of the judge and said their own quiet, damning things. Timothy was called next. He testified to what he had witnessed and what he had understood about Griggs's intentions toward the Lockhart parcel. He was careful to distinguish between what he knew directly and what he had inferred, because Marsh had drilled him thoroughly on this distinction, and he gave his testimony in the flat, matter-of-fact tone that he used for everything that mattered, which he had found over the years was more convincing than either emotion or argument. Caldwell cross-examined him with the particular ferocity reserved for witnesses who were once insiders. He called Timothy a traitor, which Timothy did not dispute. He called him a man motivated by personal interest rather than conscience, which Timothy also did not dispute, though the nature of the personal interest he did not clarify. He suggested that Timothy's testimony was the revenge of a disgruntled employee, which made approximately two-thirds of the room look at each other with expressions that suggested this was not entirely convincing, given that Timothy appeared to have left the employment voluntarily and under his own recognizance. Then Albert Marsh presented the physical evidence, the ledger pages, the original Lockhart land patents, authenticated by the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, whose representative had made the journey specifically for this hearing. The comparison between the dates on Griggs's filed copy and the dates on the actual county archive record, which were different by 3 months, and had been altered in a way that a document examiner brought from Denver demonstrated with careful, methodical clarity. The document examiner was perhaps the most devastating witness of the day. She was a woman named Frances Whitmore, who worked for a firm in Denver that had pioneered the examination of questioned documents, and she spoke about paper, ink composition, and recording methods with the confident authority of genuine expertise. She showed Judge Fenwick, through specific examples, exactly where and how the dates on the Griggs copy had been changed, and she explained why the paper itself was inconsistent with documents from the period it claimed to be from. She was calm and precise, and entirely unimpressed by Caldwell's attempts to challenge her methodology, and the room watched her with the particular attention of people who are seeing something they did not expect to see. Caldwell attempted to introduce the county commissioner as a character witness for Griggs, and Marsh immediately objected, and then produced the documentation of the debt cancellation that had allegedly purchased the commissioner's attendance, which he had obtained through 2 weeks of very thorough and very quiet research. The commissioner was not ultimately permitted to testify, and he left the courthouse with a face that suggested he understood his political future was having a difficult afternoon. Harlan Griggs testified in his own defense. He was authoritative and plausible and had clearly been well prepared by Caldwell, and in the first 20 minutes of his testimony he was everything he needed to be. But Marsh was an exceptional cross-examiner. He moved quietly and patiently, letting Griggs establish his position, and then he began to pull at the specific threads: the payments to Decker, the timeline of the filing relative to the Lockhart death, the meeting with the county commissioner, the instruction to Cole. Each question was positioned so that the truthful answer was damaging, and the false answer was directly contradicted by the evidence already in the record. Griggs held his composure through most of it, and then he did not. The moment when he did not was when Marsh asked him, very quietly, whether he had ever had any communication with the man named Decker regarding James Lockhart specifically. Griggs said he had not. Marsh produced a letter. The letter was in Griggs's handwriting, found among Decker's belongings after Patterson's deputy had finally tracked Decker to a boarding house in Cheyenne 3 days before the hearing, and brought him back to Laramie under the kind of official encouragement that a deputy with a warrant could provide. Decker had cooperated, partially, in the way that men cooperate when they realize that the weight of evidence means cooperation is the only tool they have left. The letter was not explicit. It was not an instruction to commit any specific act, but it referred to the Lockhart situation in terms that left very little charitable interpretation available, and it had been written 4 days before James Lockhart died. The room went very quiet when Marsh read the letter into the record. Judge Fenwick ruled from the bench. It was not a quick ruling. Fenwick was thorough and he was measured, and he walked through the evidence systematically, giving each element its appropriate weight. He ruled that the Griggs filing was fraudulent, based on the document examiner's testimony and the ledger evidence. He ruled that the original Lockhart patents were valid and properly recorded. He ruled that Dorothy Lockhart's claim was legitimate and that the land belonged to her under the provisions of the Homestead Act and the laws of Wyoming Territory. He referred the matter of James Lockhart's death and the payments to Decker to the county sheriff and the Territorial Attorney General's Office for Criminal Investigation. He did all of this in a steady, judicial voice that gave the proceedings the weight of the law functioning as it was supposed to function, which was something that Timothy had not entirely been sure was going to happen, and which moved him more than he had expected. Dorothy sat at her table through the ruling with her hands folded in her lap and the same straightness of spine she had maintained all day, and when Fenwick finished, she closed her eyes for 3 seconds and then opened them and looked straight ahead at nothing in particular, and the expression on her face was the most complete thing Timothy had seen in a long time. He was watching her from the gallery. He had been watching her all day. He did not pretend otherwise, even to himself. After the room had emptied of most of its observers, and the legal parties had completed their various acknowledgments, and Griggs had departed with Caldwell in the kind of controlled fury that was almost more frightening than its uncontrolled version, Timothy found Dorothy in the corridor outside the courtroom. She was standing with Albert Marsh, who was talking, but when Timothy appeared, she said something to Marsh that concluded the conversation, and Marsh nodded and moved away. Dorothy turned to Timothy. Her composure had held all day, and it was still holding, but it was holding the way a dam holds against high water, and he could see the effort of it. "You did that," she said. "We did that," he said. "Cole did that. Francis Whitmore did that. Marsh did that." "You started it," she said. "You walked out of that land office and stayed on the boardwalk." He looked at her and she looked at him, and the corridor was cold, and the sounds of the courthouse went on around them, and none of it was particularly relevant to what was happening between them, which was not nothing. "I would like to buy you dinner," he said, "if you are willing, not as a business matter, as an actual dinner." Dorothy Lockhart considered this for a moment with the thoroughness she brought to everything. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." They ate at the best restaurant in Laramie, which was not grand but was warm and the food was good, and they talked for 3 hours over plates that went mostly cold because neither of them was focused on the food. They talked about everything except the one thing that was largest between them, and they talked around it so carefully and so thoroughly that by the end of the evening it was the only thing in the room. He walked her back to the hotel. On the boardwalk in front of the hotel door in the cold November dark with the stars enormous over the Laramie Range, he said, "I want you to know that my involvement in this was not, I did not do any of it because of what I feel for you. It was what was right, regardless of that." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "That is part of why I trust you." "Part of," he noted. "The other parts accumulated," she said, and there was something in her voice that was the nearest thing to warmth he had heard from her that was not at a remove. "I am going to wait," he said. "However long is right. I am not in any particular hurry." She looked at him in the dark, and her expression was open in a way that it had not been before, the specific openness of a person who has made a decision and is living in the moment after making it. "I appreciate that," she said. "I am still, James has only been gone 8 weeks. I am still finding the edges of it." "I know," he said. "Take all the time you need." She went inside, and he stood on the boardwalk in the dark and looked at the stars and breathed the cold air, and the thing in his chest was warm and patient and entirely without urgency, and it was the most peaceful he had felt in years. The investigation into James Lockhart's death moved more slowly than the land hearing, as criminal investigations generally do, especially in territorial jurisdictions where resources were limited, and the subject of the investigation had 11 years of accumulated influence. Harlan Griggs was not arrested in November. He was not charged in November. The Territorial Attorney General's office sent a representative to Laramie in early December who met with Patterson and Marsh and reviewed the material, and the representative went back to Cheyenne with a large envelope of documents, and the understanding that this was a serious matter that required serious attention. It took until February of 1880 for the charges to be filed. They were filed against Griggs for conspiracy, and for the falsification of public records. They were filed against Caldwell for the same. Decker, who had by then been cooperative to the degree that his own attorney had managed to negotiate, provided testimony that was, while not fully explicit on the question of what had actually happened to James Lockhart on that ridge, deeply suggestive, and combined with the circumstantial evidence concerning the timing of payments, constituted a case that the territorial attorney general believed was prosecutable. Griggs was tried in the spring of 1880 in Cheyenne before a federal judge. It was a proceeding that Laramie followed with intense attention, and Timothy followed it from the Lockhart parcel, where he had been living and working for the previous 4 months. This requires explanation. After the hearing, Dorothy had returned to the parcel with her things. The 2 Griggs men who had been camped at the fence line departed when it became clear that their employer had more pressing concerns than maintaining a territorial show of force over land he had just lost in a public proceeding. Dorothy had returned to find her house exactly as it had been when she left it, which was a relief, because she had not been entirely sure that no one would interfere with it in her absence. She had a farm to run, a house to maintain through a Wyoming winter, a barn with animals that needed daily attention. She was capable and she was stubborn and she had managed it before, but it was a great deal for one person, and she had no husband and her nearest neighbor, the Pryors, were 2 miles north. She had hired hands in the summer for the heavier work, but in winter she had managed alone. Timothy had gone back to the Griggs ranch, collected his belongings and his final wages from the foreman who now ran the place in Griggs's increasingly distracted absence, and he had camped for 3 nights in Laramie trying to figure out what he was going to do next. He had some money saved. He had no immediate job. He had an attachment to this particular part of Wyoming that he had not felt toward any place before, and that he was honest enough with himself to understand was not entirely about the landscape. He had ridden out to the Lockhart parcel on a Thursday morning in late November and found Dorothy fixing a section of roof that had taken damage in a windstorm, perched on the roof with a hammer and a look of concentrated determination that he could see from the yard. He had gotten off his horse and called up to her. "Do you need a hand?" She had looked down at him from the roof with an expression that held about 5 different things in it. "Do you have experience with roofs?" "Some," he said. "My father's farmhouse required constant maintenance." She had considered this for a moment and then said, "There is a ladder on the west side." He had stayed through the winter. Not in the house, which would have been inappropriate and which neither of them suggested. He had built himself a bunk in the barn, which he had insulated against the cold with additional boards and a small iron stove, and it was warmer than many places he had slept and considerably cleaner than most bunkhouses. He worked the property for wages, which Dorothy paid him in the same businesslike manner she applied to everything, and the wages were fair and neither of them made the arrangement into something it was not yet supposed to be. But he was there, and she was there, and Wyoming winters are long and the evenings in the house are warm, and the conversation across a kitchen table in the lamplight is a particular kind of intimacy regardless of how carefully you frame it as practical or neighborly or professional. He helped with the livestock and the feed and the repairs. She made extraordinary food and kept the house in a way that was efficient without being cold, full of small domestic details that he had not expected, and that moved him persistently. She had books, a considerable number of them, and she read seriously and with opinion, and they argued about some of the books in the way that people argue when they are actually interested in each other's minds. She read him the newspaper when it came, and he fixed things that needed fixing, and they played checkers on long dark evenings, and she was mercilessly competitive at checkers and did not pretend otherwise. He fell more completely in love with her across that winter than he had thought was possible, and he carried it with the patience he had promised her, taking nothing, pushing nothing, letting it be what it was. January came and went. February arrived with Griggs's charges being filed in Cheyenne, which they heard about from the newspaper, and which prompted a conversation that was the first one to directly acknowledge the underlying history between Griggs and the Lockhart land without either of them deflecting to the practical. Dorothy sat at the kitchen table with the newspaper in her hands and said, very quietly, "I hope they prove what happened to James." Timothy was at the stove with coffee. He turned around. "I hope so too," he said. She looked at the newspaper. "He deserved better than that, Ridge." "He did," Timothy said. She looked up at him, and there was something in her face that was not the iron composure and was not quite the grief, but something in between, the specific expression of a person who is beginning to live alongside a loss rather than inside it, which is different and is, in its own complicated way, a form of survival. "He would have liked you," she said. "James would have liked you. He appreciated people who were honest about what they were and what they had done wrong." Timothy held his coffee cup and absorbed this. "That is a generous thing to say." "It is not meant to be generous," she said. "It is meant to be true." He sat down across from her at the table. The lamp was between them, yellow and steady. Outside, the Wyoming winter did what it did, and inside the kitchen was warm and close, and it smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the particular smell of this particular house that had become, over the course of 4 months, associated in his mind entirely with her. "Dorothy," he said. "I know," she said, which was not a response that could be logically defended and was also, he thought, perhaps the most complete response she could have given. They sat there in the lamplight for another hour, talking about other things, and nothing explicit was said, and nothing needed to be, because some things are communicated in the space between words and in the quality of proximity, and in the fact of two people choosing, repeatedly, to be in the same room. Griggs was convicted in April of 1880 of falsification of public records and conspiracy to defraud. The evidence concerning James Lockhart's death was not sufficient for a murder charge, though the territorial attorney's position was that Griggs had arranged for Lockhart's death through Decker as an intermediary. Decker was convicted on a lesser charge and sentenced to 4 years. Griggs received a 7-year sentence and the forced sale of his land holdings to satisfy debts arising from the civil proceedings that followed the criminal conviction. The Griggs Ranch was purchased at auction by a consortium of smaller ranchers who had long resented Griggs's dominance of the region, and its dismemberment into smaller parcels actually opened up additional grazing access for neighboring properties, including the Lockhart farm, which was an irony that Timothy appreciated and which Dorothy acknowledged with a precise smile when they discussed it. The conviction was not the same as justice for James Lockhart's death, and Dorothy knew it and said so plainly when she read the verdict in the newspaper. Timothy sat across from her at the table and did not try to offer comfort that would have been false. He said, "No, it is not the same," and she looked at him with something that was gratitude for not pretending, and they sat with the incompleteness of it for a while before moving on to other things, because that is what you do with incompleteness when you cannot fix it. Spring came to Wyoming with the kind of extravagance that makes the winter worth it. The eastern fork of the Platte ran high and loud with snowmelt, and the bottomland turned an extraordinary green, and the kitchen garden behind the house was replanted with a thoroughness and care that suggested permanence, which it was. On an afternoon in early May, Dorothy and Timothy were in the kitchen garden, and she was showing him the proper spacing for bean rows, which she had apparently been doing wrong in his opinion, and which she disputed with the confidence of a woman who had successfully grown beans for 3 years, and did not require instruction from a man who had grown up on a failing Ohio farm. The argument was the kind that was approximately 20% about beans and the rest about something else entirely, and it ended with both of them laughing in the way that people laugh when they have stopped being careful with each other. He was looking at her laughing in the kitchen garden in the May afternoon light, with dirt on her hands and her hair coming loose and her whole face open and alive, and he thought, "This is it, then. I have something to say to you," he said. She looked at him. The laughter went, but the openness stayed, and she looked at him with those deep amber brown eyes and waited. "I have been patient," he said. "I told you I would be, and I have been. And I will keep being patient as long as you need. But I want you to know that what I feel for you is not going anywhere, and it is not getting smaller. If anything, it keeps getting larger, which is inconvenient, but there it is." He paused, because he was better at being honest about things that had already happened than at saying the most important thing before it had happened, but he kept going. "I love you. I have loved you since the middle of that stagecoach ride to Rawlins, somewhere around the Medicine Bow Pass, and it has only gotten more specific and more certain since then. I am not asking you to feel the same thing right now. I am just telling you what is true." Dorothy Lockhart stood in her kitchen garden with dirt on her hands and looked at Timothy Bancroft in the May sunshine, and he watched her absorb it the way she absorbed everything, fully and without performance. "Timothy," she said. "Yes," he said. "I have been waiting for you to say that since February," she said. "And I have been thinking some very similar things for approximately the same length of time." She looked at her hands. She looked at him. "I loved James. I will always have loved James. And he is gone, and the world did something terrible and irreversible, and I have been living with that. But I am also alive." She stopped and seemed to find the words again. "And you are the most decent and most honest and most unexpectedly welcome person who has walked into my life in a very long time. And I am not willing to pretend I do not know what I feel because the timing seems complicated." He crossed the garden in 3 steps and took her dirt-covered hands in his, and she looked up at him, and the look between them was the cleanest, most uncomplicated thing either of them had felt in years. He kissed her in the kitchen garden, gently and without urgency, and she kissed him back with the particular quality of a woman who has made a decision and is entirely committed to it. And the bean rose went unfinished, and neither of them cared remotely. They were married in September of 1880, in Laramie, in a small ceremony that was attended by the Pryors, by Albert Marsh and his wife, by Ira Cole, who had largely left off drinking and who was working as a bookkeeper for a hardware firm, by Francis Whitmore, who had taken an interest in the case and had corresponded with Dorothy throughout the spring, and by old Pete Callahan from the livery, who cried, which surprised everyone including Pete. The ceremony was performed by a minister who was brief and genuine, and who said exactly what needed to be said, and Timothy stood at the front of the small church and watched Dorothy walk toward him in a dress that was not black, the first he had seen her in that was not black, a deep blue the color of the Platte in morning light, and the sight of her walking toward him in that dress undid him completely, and he did not try to reassemble himself. She took his hands, and her hands were not shaking this time. They said the words, the old words that have been said in every language for a very long time, and the words landed in Timothy's chest with the weight of something he intended absolutely and completely, and from the expression on Dorothy's face, he understood that she intended the same. They went back to the parcel, which was home now in the fullest sense of the word, and they built the life that the land had been waiting for. The work of a farm on the Wyoming frontier in 1880 was relentless and physical and demanding in ways that modern life has largely edited out, and Timothy threw himself into it with the thoroughness of a man who has finally found a thing worth doing fully. He was good with cattle and good with horses and better at carpentry than he had modestly let on, and over the fall of 1880, he built a proper addition onto the house that included a larger bedroom and a room that Dorothy said they might need in a year or so, which she said with the particular casual precision that he had learned meant she was very sure of something and had already done the calculations. She was right that they needed the room. In June of 1881, their son was born. They named him James Timothy Bancroft, for both the men who had shaped the land they lived on, and he was loud and robust and had Timothy's light eyes and Dorothy's stubborn, focused expression, and the combination was formidable from the first week. Timothy held his son in the hours after he was born, in the bedroom of the house on the rise above the eastern fork of the Platte, and Dorothy lay in the bed, with the particular exhausted, luminous expression of a woman who has done an enormous thing and knows it. And Timothy held his son and looked at his wife, and felt the full, specific weight of the life he was living. "Thank you," he said, which was not quite equal to the occasion but was the best he could do. She looked at him from the pillow. "For what specifically?" "For being alive," he said. "For filing that claim, for being on that boardwalk." She smiled, the full smile that he had been working to earn since October of 1879, and said, "You stayed on the boardwalk." "You were worth staying for," he said. Baby James made a sound of opinion about something, and they both looked at him. And the look was the one that parents have exchanged over newborns since the beginning of parenting, the particular stunned gratitude of people who have made something that exceeds their expectations and their comprehension simultaneously. The Pryor family came to see the baby in July, and Mrs. Pryor, who was a direct and practical woman, held the baby for approximately 2 minutes and then said to Dorothy, "You will need to put in a larger garden next summer. 2 adults and a growing boy require planning." Dorothy said she was already planning, and Mrs. Pryor said that was what she had expected, and the 2 women went inside to discuss it in detail, leaving Timothy on the porch with Mr. Pryor, who said nothing for a comfortable stretch and then said, "Good life you have built." And Timothy said, "Yes," which was the only accurate answer. Ira Cole visited that summer as well, and they had him to dinner, and Dorothy made a meal that was extraordinary, and Cole ate it with the expression of a man who has been eating saloon food for longer than is good for him. And at the end of it he said to Timothy, quietly, "I was not sure, when you walked into that Rollins saloon, whether you were a good man or not. I want to say I am glad to have decided you are." Timothy thought about that and said, "I am not sure I was a good man yet. I think I was in the process of becoming one." Cole considered this seriously. "That might be the most honest thing I have heard anyone say in years." The criminal proceedings against Griggs had run their course by then, and the civil suit that followed had completed as well, and the land was secured and the paperwork was filed and the law had done, imperfectly but genuinely, the thing it was supposed to do. James Lockhart's death would not be fully answered for, because the law had not been able to build the case to the standard required for the most serious charge. And Dorothy lived with that incompleteness in the way that people live with incompleteness when there is no alternative, which is to say she held it alongside everything else, and did not let it prevent her from living. She told Timothy once, in the quiet after the baby was asleep and the house was dark and warm, that she thought James would have been glad. Not glad about the dying, obviously, not glad about the forgery and the theft and all of it, but glad about the land being held and the truth being spoken and the life that had come after. He would have said, Dorothy told him, that land is for living on, and that the worst thing that could happen to it is for no one to live on it well. Timothy thought that James Lockhart sounded like a man who understood things correctly. The years moved the way years do on a working farm, full of the specific texture of daily life that is not dramatic but is deeply substantive. Seasons, animals, crops and their failures and their successes. The growth of a small boy who developed opinions about everything with great speed, and the relentless energy of someone who has a great deal of world to investigate. The gradual deepening of 2 people who had begun in crisis, and built something that was not born of convenience or fear, or the need for anyone to rescue anyone, but of genuine recognition and genuine respect that had grown, over time, into the kind of love that does not require constant narration, because it is present in every ordinary thing. Timothy broke his left arm in 1882, falling from the barn roof that he should have known needed more careful respect, and Dorothy set the bone with a competence that surprised him, until he remembered that she had grown up with a practical father and had learned useful things. She set the arm and splinted it and told him that he was not to climb any roof for the next 8 weeks, and he said he understood, and she said she meant it, and he said he understood that too, and she gave him the look that had been making him feel appropriately chastened since 1879, and went back to work. He watched her go from his chair by the window with his splinted arm elevated as instructed, and he was as happy as he had ever been in his life. In the fall of 1882, Dorothy told him she was expecting again, with the same casual precision she brought to things she had already calculated thoroughly, and he sat down at the kitchen table and put his face in his hands and laughed, which she found puzzling until he explained that it was the specific laugh of a man who has more happiness than he has framework to process. Their daughter, Clara, was born in April of 1883. Dorothy named her without consulting Timothy, presenting the name as a done thing, which made him smile because he recognized the name and understood the gift she was giving him, the specific gift of a woman who has listened carefully enough to know what a man needs without his having to ask for it. He held his daughter and looked at his wife and said, "Thank you," again, and she said, "I am beginning to think that is your primary mode of expression." And he said that for the things that mattered it seemed to cover the territory, and she smiled the full smile. Young James was nearly 2 when Clara arrived, and his relationship with his sister was the specific kind of determined advocacy that older children produce when they decide a new family member is acceptable and worth protecting. He was a serious child with his mother's precision and his father's patient observation, and he sat next to the cradle for approximately 40 minutes on the day Clara came home, and then announced that she seemed fine, which was his conclusion, and went back to the business of his own investigations. Dorothy and Timothy lay in the darkness that night with the baby asleep between them and James asleep in his room down the hall and the Wyoming night enormous outside, and Dorothy said, "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" "Tell me," he said. "The boardwalk," she said. "That morning in October. You were still there when I came out, and I had been so certain you would be gone. So certain that you were just another man who worked for Griggs and would choose what was easy. You hid it well," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "Not of you specifically, of everything. I had filed that claim alone with 6 weeks of grief and 3 years of my husband's work in that satchel, and I walked out of that office and you were still on the boardwalk." She paused, and I thought, whatever else happens, this man stayed. He was quiet for a moment. He reached across in the dark and found her hand. "I almost did not stay," he said honestly. "I almost walked away. I had told myself my whole adult life that not getting involved was the right way to be, and it was comfortable and it was safe and it was wrong." "What changed?" she asked. He thought about it as carefully as he always tried to think about important things. "You walked out of that door and you were shaking and your voice was not, and something in me understood that whatever kind of man I wanted to be was going to be decided in the next 30 seconds. She turned her hand over and held his. The baby made a small sound of contentment. Outside, the night wind moved off the Laramie Range and across the bottomland, and through the grass along the eastern fork of the Platte, which was running low and quiet in the April night. And the land did what land does, which is to continue, and hold, and sustain what is built upon it by people who treat it with the respect it deserves. The Lockhart Bancroft parcel ran a good herd and a good garden and a good life for the next several decades, expanding gradually as Timothy acquired adjacent parcels when they became available, always carefully, always legally, with the particular attention of a man who understood what the alternative looked like. He became known in the county as a man whose word was absolute, which is the kind of reputation that takes years to build and is worth every year of it. Dorothy expanded the kitchen garden to the scale that Mrs. Pryor had recommended, and then expanded it further, and then began providing produce to the Laramie market on a regular basis, which generated income that she reinvested in the property with the precision she brought to everything financial. She also began, in 1885, a correspondence with the Territorial Land Office that eventually resulted in her serving on an informal advisory board for homestead dispute resolution, drawing on her experience with the Griggs case to help develop clearer procedures for handling fraudulent filings. This was not a paid position, and it was not without resistance from various quarters who held the conventional view that women's expertise in legal matters was inherently limited. But Dorothy brought to every meeting the same quality she brought to everything: full preparation, complete honesty, total competence, and the particular patience of a woman who has already survived things that those objectors could not imagine, and she outlasted all of the resistance eventually. Ira Cole got married in 1884 to a widow from Rawlins who ran the boarding house where he had been living, and the wedding was a cheerful and slightly chaotic affair to which the Bancrofts drove 3 hours in the wagon and Timothy stood up as a witness, which Cole had requested with the specific formality of a man who does not take such things lightly. Francis Whitmore, the document examiner from Denver, became a lasting correspondent of Dorothy's, and they exchanged letters several times a year for many years, discussing cases and methods and the general state of territorial law. And Francis visited Laramie in 1886 and stayed for a week, and was a magnificent guest who argued about everything with great enjoyment, and left a book on questioned documents that James, then 5, immediately decided he needed to read, despite not being ready for it yet. James, as it turned out, grew into a young man with a mind precisely suited to law, which he pursued with the focused determination of someone who has been raised by two people who understand why the law matters and what happens when it fails. He studied in Cheyenne, and then in the East, and came back to Wyoming, and Timothy watched his son practice the law with the same quiet pride he had applied to everything about his children since the first day of each of them. Clara grew into a woman who was the specific combination of her parents that neither of them had quite anticipated, which was Dorothy's precision applied to Timothy's quiet humor, and the resulting personality was formidable and charming in equal measure, and entirely her own. She stayed close to the parcel longer than James did, marrying a rancher from the northern part of the county who was as steady and as decent as the ones Dorothy had told Timothy she hoped for. The parcel itself, the bottomland along the eastern fork of the Platte that James Lockhart had broken with his own hands in 1876, and that Dorothy had fought for in a land office in October of 1879, with shaking hands and an unwavering voice, remained the center of everything for all of it. Timothy walked the fence line every morning when the weather permitted, and the habit was not the inspection habit he had once performed for Griggs, but something different, something closer to gratitude, the specific morning ritual of a man who is aware of how the thing he has could have gone otherwise. He thought about the boardwalk. He thought about it more often than he would have admitted to most people, and more than he needed to, because the lesson of it was already thoroughly learned. But he thought about it anyway, the October morning in 1879, the cold air, the bright sky, the sound of his own breathing while he decided what kind of man he was going to be. He thought about her walking out of that door and finding him still there, and the expression on her face before she controlled it. Surprised. She had been genuinely surprised. He had made a career since then of continuing to surprise her, and she had made a career of doing the same to him, and it was the most productive and rewarding competition he had ever engaged in, and he intended to keep at it for as long as he had years. On an October evening in 1895, 16 years after the morning he had stood on the boardwalk, Timothy and Dorothy sat on the porch of the house on the rise above the eastern fork of the Platte. The sun was going down behind the Laramie Range in the way it went down in October in Wyoming, which was a performance of extraordinary extravagance. The children were grown and gone, mostly, though Clara's family was close enough to visit regularly. The farm was quiet in the evening way. The creek moved along below, clear and cold in the October air. Dorothy had a book in her lap, but she was not reading it. Timothy had his coffee, but it had gone cold and he had not noticed. They were both watching the sunset in the comfortable, companionable silence of two people who have run out of anything particular to say, not because they have nothing to say, but because there is nothing left that requires words. After a while, Dorothy said, "Do you know what today is?" He did. 16 years, he said. She nodded. Since the land office. Since the boardwalk, he said. She smiled. The amber-brown eyes in the sunset light were as remarkable as they had ever been, possibly more so. "I was so angry that morning," she said, "and so frightened. I had that satchel and those documents, and I was entirely alone, and I did not know if it was going to be enough." "It was enough," he said. "You were enough." "You helped," she said, with the dry precision that was one of the great constants of his life. "A little," he agreed. She reached over without looking away from the sunset and took his hand, the same gesture she had made in the dark the night Clara came home, and he held her hand as he had held it then, and the evening moved around them in all its October extravagance. The land stretched out below them, the bottomland and the creek and the fence lines and the barn and the kitchen garden, everything James Lockhart had begun and Dorothy had fought for, and the two of them had built into something that would outlast them both, held in the law and in the ground and in the people who would come after them, and know what it cost and what it was worth. Timothy Bancroft had never stopped thinking about her. From the October morning she walked through a door with shaking hands and a clear voice, and he never would, and he did not want to. She leaned her head against his shoulder, in the way she had been doing for 15 years, and he tilted his head against hers, and they watched the Wyoming sun go down behind the mountains, and the land held them, and the evening was good, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.